Great.
Okay, so welcome everyone to the Global Foresight Summit 2021 Beyond Uncertainty. We are co-organizing this edition with the APF and the WFR, and we are continuing with yet another session in this year's edition. For this session, we have Daria Krivonos, and Daria is the CEO at the Copenhagen Institute for Future Studies. And in her current role, she combines her natural curiosity in global dynamics with trends and scenario analysis, and when scanning the horizon for developments, with their interconnectedness and potential societal and business implications. Daria is going to be with us for the next 45 minutes talking about the crumbling pillars or the turn of the 20th century tide. So, Daria, welcome to the Global Foresight Summit, and I leave you on the stage.
Thank you so much. I'll jump right into it, and I assume everyone can see my screen. Right? So it's a little bit of a dramatic title, and I chose the background picture to fit it. Now, I'm actually going to use these pillars as a little bit of a metaphor in terms of how we've built the centuries preceding the 21st. So for the last 200 to 300 years, the world has been moving along a certain tide. It's been moving in a particular direction, driven by similar forces that then just were emphasized and getting stronger throughout the last century as well. And then we reached the millennium and the end of the last century, and those of us living in the West, we would think, this is only going to continue, and I'll show why. But if anything, COVID has shown us things can be different. It's been a flashlight through some of the cracks we have even in the Western societies that really need to be fixed. And these are things we've been taking for granted. So this is based on work we did before COVID, actually. So if anything, in the beginning, I felt that COVID stole my shine, that it's now actually telling the exact same story, but I still think it's an extremely important story to tell, because the reason we've dealt with COVID in so many different ways is due to some of the factors that I will mention now. So when we say pillars, we're looking at 4 particular pillars that we believe, first of all, we looked 100 years back. So we said, well, since the end of World War I or the beginning of World War I, in particular, we've seen 4 main pillars that have been going through a transformation. And here we have the liberal democracies, technological development, Western-led globalization. I think often when we talk about globalization, we forget that it's a movement where you combine different cultures or where you find common denominators. But let's be honest, it was driven by a certain region, which means that a lot of the standards, etc., we've introduced and are now using were led by the West. But globalization can very well continue without us. So it could be someone else taking the lead, and the world would still be coming together, but not necessarily in our image or by our standards. And then the last pillar could be a little surprising, but this is climate change. And the reason we have it here is because for many, many years, this has been ongoing since the Industrial Revolution, but we haven't had an issue with it. So it wasn't really raised as a concern. Now looking back, there are a lot of scientists saying, well, we actually started ringing the alarm bells back in the 70s and 80s, but no one listened. And it's true. But I think it's fair to say that since the turn of the century in particular, it's been something that has been giving way in the way we used to see it. Now, when we look at the way the world is put together, the way the world is structured today, so in Denmark, we had a parliamentary election back in 2019, and I voted, and I was debating online and in public, and I would protest if I disagreed. So I would go to the streets and I would use my democratic rights to raise my opinion and share it with others. And it's because, and I take it for granted because I live in a democracy, in a liberal democracy, where I take it as my right. Even during COVID in Denmark, we've preserved the right to for democratic expression of speech, which means you can still gather in demonstration for as long as you follow the rules that are set out by the state. So, but I took it for granted. Now, I was born and raised on the other side of the Iron Curtain, and so I can relate to it not being something that is a given right. Maybe it's constitutionally it is, but you can't always exercise it. So increasingly, we live in a world, at least many of us, where we take some of these things for granted. But it wasn't always like that. And I don't mean to start a big discussion on the women's movement, but I think it's a good proxy to say that when half the population can't vote, you're not really a democracy. And if anything that gives us half and half, it's the gender. So something we take for granted is actually not very old. So when my mom turned 18 and was eligible to vote, she could not have voted in Switzerland, and she could not have voted in Portugal. So these are countries that we would usually look to as our neighbors and associate ourselves with in terms of democratic movements, but their democracies, in the sense that we know them, are only some 40 years old. And I get 40, 50 years old, and that's saying something. That when my mom was old enough, she actually couldn't have voted in these two countries. And then, of course, you still have countries where women can't vote. You have countries where no one can vote. And then you have countries where people can vote all they want, but it's not really going to count. So taking something for granted just because we live in it today sometimes makes us blind to the reality of its fragility, its necessity, and I'll get back to that, and of course, how young it is. Same goes for globalization. Now, if I were to go backpacking in the Amazon or wherever, and I would feel extremely adventurous, I would put on my backpack and I would leave my life behind, and I would feel like I'm almost on a different planet. When I would leave the rainforest and I would stop into a cafe, I would still expect to find a menu in English. I would look for a Coke, and I would look for a Visa card sign on the door. And those are normal things today. We expect that because when we talk about globalization, the world is recognizable and it's global because it was created in our image. When I say ours, I mean the region that has been dominating economically and politically for the last at least 100 years or so. And there's nothing wrong with that because there was technology to support it, there was economic might to support it, etc. But we just forget that we take it for granted that it's our brands and it's our standards and it's Visa and etc. etc. And there's nothing natural about it. It was just pretty much the winner decides and set the rules. Now, we also got a little bit used to being ahead in terms of technology, because let's face it, Industry 1.0, 2.0, etc., were led by the Northern Hemisphere. So first, and it's natural to then just exacerbate and prolong our history into the future and say, well, with Industry 4.0, we're probably going to lead that. I beg to differ, and I think anyone following the debate today would also beg to differ and at least disagree in the fact that that Industry 4.0 was not going to have one single leader. If anything, it's going to be a new competition, and likely there's quite a big chance that we may not come out on top. So if we start a little bit with democracy, well, the reason we mentioned, I call them the pillars, is also that if we look at a century back, we've been building these structures on which we stand. So, we had all the different revolts and wars within in the beginning of the last century, at least in Europe. So we had the falls of the monarchies. World War I destroyed several monarchies across Europe. We had the revolutions, the revolution in Russia, and of course, there's many monarchies being replaced by republics. And then we continue through the 20s and 40s, and it just continues. The Ottoman Empire falls, Italy, Bulgaria, etc. And we start discussing things in more democratic terms. So we suddenly have the World Bank, the United Nations, so the Bretton Woods institutions, NATO, etc. So we're going from imperial ideas to more democratic ideas, at least within our own countries. And then we start shaping these alliances. We continue building, so then we have the civil rights movements, the Voting Act in the US. So democracy keeps getting tailwind and gathering strength. Then the Soviet Union falls in the late last century, and now we're looking for this new democratic wave of all the ex-republics. Finally, we also see a fall in the monarchy of Greece. We see the end of the Cold War, and democracy is on a roll. We start shaping the European Union, and we have the Arab Spring towards the end of the century. Now, Frank Fukuyama wrote a book in 1989 based on an essay where he said we're at the end of history. And I think what he meant was this, the democratic rule has come as the superior ideology to all others. And if anything, you should probably take away is, of course, Frank Fukuyama is still a brilliant thinker, but you should probably never write a book and title it The End of History if you're young enough to see your theories being proven wrong. But that's just a note to self. So we're reaching the end of the last century, and we're standing on this pillar, right? And we're overlooking the world, and we're saying, okay, the Middle East is rebelling against corrupt leaders. Democracy has a great chance there. The former 13 time zones of the Soviet Union are also having a democratic wave sweeping across them, etc. Now it's just a question of time before the rest of the world follows our lead. And then we dial into the year 2000 and things start happening. So 2001, after 9/11, we have the war on terror. And the reason I bring it up is because what happened in the war on terror and the aftermath is that we invaded Iraq. And that was done without the UN mandate. So suddenly the one institution on the left side that was part of the pillars we were building, we were putting these institutions in place to say never again. We're all going to sit around a table. We have the Security Council, and we're going to follow these international rules to make sure that it never happens again. And then the Security Council said no, and the coalition of the willing decided that they would go to war anyway. So as much as I don't want to debate the Iraqi war, it was a symbolic move against the institutions that were put there to safeguard the world, the way we put the world together last century. Then we continue and we get into the Great Recession and the crack of the Lehman Brothers, the financial crisis. So not only are the institutions a bit shaken, now suddenly we're questioning capitalism. Remember Occupy Wall Street, the 1%, the rest of it. So suddenly not only are the alliances being shaken and the institutions we put in place, now we're also questioning the economic models that we've been propagating across the globe for many years. Then we see the Arab Spring turn sour. So hope somewhat, the whatever light was lit in the Middle East is being put out. The refugee crisis tests European solidarity, and we failed the test, if you will. So we all remember the horrible pictures of people reaching the shores of Europe and the little boy who passed away in the journey. And it shook us because what we did is that we closed our borders. So a union that was based on free movement suddenly shut its borders also internally. And we failed the test because this was just a rehearsal of what may come if we're looking at the projections of the climate refugees that will surpass the refugees from military conflict in 2040. So the openness, the collaboration, the ideals that we held high are beginning to get challenged, and we have cracks. Then we have Brexit. One of the core members of the European Union decides they don't want to be part of the union anymore. Of course, we know that it took years for it to actually materialize, but now it's actually here. In 2018, the Economist Index of Democracy is now characterizing the US as a flawed democracy now. Wow. So this is one of the bannermen of democratic rule is now being downgraded. And then COVID came, and we've seen democratic principles being pushed to the side in many countries where we thought that would never happen. For some of them, it's temporary. So we have sunset clauses that all of the extraordinary powers given to the governments will expire the moment the coronavirus is over. But still, we're seeing that temporary measures put in place have a tendency to get sticky. Even in the Nordics, etc., so countries where we never thought that was happen, we see the populations actually challenging these democratic compromises, if not violations. And of course, we had the storming of the Capitol in earlier this year also. So if anything, the pillar that we built, that we were standing on, and now democracy was in a great role, well, the cracks are there, and we need to start working hard to mend them and to preserve the structures if we think that democracy should make it into the next century. But I can't blame Frank Fukuyama for being optimistic because it was going so well. We had 3 democratic waves in the last century. So after World War I, after World War II, then we had decolonization, fall of communism. It was going up and up and up and up. And now we've seen what's happening, unfortunately, over the last couple of years. And if democracy is people and people's beliefs, then, well, let's look at what the world map actually looks like. So the bars are population size, and the full bar is 2010, and the stripe bar is to 2050. So these are the UN projections of population sizes as share of global. And if we look at the increases and the decreases, well, a lot of things are going to happen in Europe. We're going to see some in Asia, in terms of decrease in population share, and a lot of the red areas are actually going to increase in population size. And if people are ideologies and ideologies are regimes, well, then just at least in terms of demographic progressions, this does not bode very well for democratic rule unless we have more parts of the world which we can dye blue. Now, but what is happening in terms of support for democracy? So now we said the cracks are there. Population-wise, it's not looking very well unless we start fighting for it. And this is how we feel about it. So democracy has been in decline over the last at least 12 if not more years, because the latest that came out, I think the 2020 index, is not looking much better across most parameters. So democratic indices are down. And I think one of the few bright spots remains voter turnout. So the support for people trying to make their voices heard, especially in the light of Corona and the elections in the US, that has been on the rise. Pretty much everything else, all the other indicators are turning downwards. So democracy is not in very good shape. And if we look at some of the propagators of at least challenging regimes, they feel they're having a field day. So this is Viktor Orban, who actually started out as a democratic supporter and somehow in the process has turned more authoritarian. And the most popular topic in the thinking today is trying to understand how systems that are not Western, not liberal democracies, and perhaps not being democracies at all, can still make nations successful. And this is what everybody's trying to grapple with. Like, if we had a superior idea, then why is it not delivering superior results? And I think that's a very fair question to ask ourselves. Be it lack of redistribution, be it the link between liberal democracies and capitalism, that where the capitalist structure has been eroding democratic rule on the sideline, or whatever it is, it's something we have to figure out, because it's hard to say that you have a superior model which doesn't deliver superior results. Now, if we look at the youth, unfortunately, we're going to have to convince them that democracy is a good idea. So on the x-axis, we have the birth, the decade of birth, which means the further you go to the right, the younger someone is. And I would love to say that those in the far right of the scale are young idealists, or, millennials, and they're just occupied with their phones and Instagram. But unfortunately, it's not true, because all the way to the right, you have people my age. And I would consider myself a grown-up, at least someone who is well informed enough to have an idea and have a view. And it may not necessarily be easily changed, because I've reached an age where I made up my mind. And those born in the 1980s actually have lower support for democracy. The question asked was whether it's essential to live in one, and this was the answer. So it's losing the popularity contest, and it's losing its support and strength in society. And you can argue, well, of course, there's an element of being taken for granted. Like I said, I voted, I debated, I marched, I can do whatever I want. So how essential is it? It's just there. It's a bit like air. Many of us would not say that we value air very much, but if we were to live without it, it would probably change. But still, I think it's starting to see, it's a stark reminder that those who are supposed to build it and strengthen it going forward actually don't attach much value to it these days. But now, one thing that is really making it a difficult time to balance these things is that technology is not waiting for anyone. And at least in Copenhagen, one of my favorite examples is the parking meters. So probably in many other European capitals, and not just European, probably in most capitals in the world, we're going from coin-based parking meters to first credit cards. And now, at least here in Copenhagen, it's very much on a smartphone. It's an app. It decides where you are, and it helps you pay for your parking, and it's really easy. Now, problem is, we didn't notice when we went from at least anonymity to privacy, to a hope of privacy, right? Because when I used to use my coins, yeah, it was cumbersome. I had to have coins on me at all times. Sometimes I would stay parked longer than I paid for. It's come back to a ticket, but at least I was anonymous. No one knew I'd been there. No one knew when I came, when I left. Now, the moment I moved to credit cards, somebody knew that I was there. You could link it to my bank details. And now with my phone, you pretty much knew exactly when I was there, where did I go afterwards, who did I meet with, etc. So the moment we introduce these technologies, we very much bank on the fact that we have democratic ideologies to support them. I believe my data will never be abused, nor will it be used against me. Because the moment you combine high use of technology with low democratic rule, you get the big brother risk. And I think we have to be aware of that, especially now with all of the apps, etc., introduced on COVID. And I'm not anti-technology, not at all. I think it's one of the reasons that we can open up as quickly as we're doing many places. We're introducing Corona passes, etc. It's just it's something we have to be mindful of, because things you implement are harder to roll back, and technology is making its way through our societies, which only raises the bar for what we have to do in terms of democratic support. Now, I'm going to do something similar with globalization. And what I say, we build it in our image. If we look back 100 years, the first container vessels went on their maiden voyage. And why do I bring up container vessels? Was because it was a complete change. It was a fundamental change in the way we traded. So suddenly, it wasn't bulks. You didn't pour things into the hull of a ship. You could actually store it in boxes and stack them, and it was far more efficient, which means it revolutionized global trade. We could go between Asia and Europe and the US in a way that we hadn't before, with quantities of goods and manner of dispatching them completely different from previously. So it was a revolution in global trade. Then we introduced the International Monetary Fund, and then we have the US dollar as a global currency. And I think in 1927, there's a newspaper in Paris that coins the term Coca-Colonization. So there's a cultural colonization going on the side. We do it with brands, products, etc. We continue up through the century, and then we have the EU again strengthening. So we set common standards. We tie more nations together in free trade. We have the third industrial revolution. And then we have, of course, the fall of the Iron Curtain, which means even more of the world is interconnected. Amazon.com launched their online shopping. Again, we see things moving across the globe in a whole new way. The Economist published the Big Mac Index. Now, those of you who are not economists, just a brief note on that. So this is actually a formal way to measure differences in prices, because not only do you do exchange rates, but as you look at the Big Mac Index for purchasing power parity indications, say how many Big Macs can I buy at my salary? And then you do a comparison across the globe, and you have a better idea of what is my actual purchasing power. But it's a burger, right? So it says something about the way how a certain region starts dominating the globe. A lot of it is for the better. We know that globalization, as much as it's been met with criticism these last years, it still it lifted millions out of poverty. It's connected regions. It's given us interdependencies, which mean we're less likely to go to war, etc. So in many ways, this has been a very positive development, albeit with some caveats. So it continues, and suddenly China becomes member of the WTO, and we see trade explode between the regions. We see the offshoring wave. Facebook goes online, connecting people across the planet. And then in Egyptian McDonald's, you could actually have a McFalafel. So, whoa, this is a merging of culture. So again, we're walking into year 2000, 2001, looking out in the world and saying it's going to be great. It's going to continue. We're all going to trade. Everybody's going to get better, richer, et cetera, et cetera. And then, unfortunately, we have a similar picture here. So first you have the rise of the far-right populism, which means we're beginning to introduce my nation first, and this is way before Trump. So we're looking at closing ourselves in, introducing restrictions, introducing frictions, etc. Then the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is the first financial institutions of its scale to be launched without the US as a founding member. So suddenly, this is not Western-led only, this is globalization, but with a different flavor. Then we have the Belt and Road Initiative in China, which is a very, very ambitious infrastructure investment plan, going all the way up to Venice. So those of you who know it, are familiar with it, the scale of it. It's huge. So it's about it's pretty much, I think it's 10 times the Marshall Aid. And again, that's where the comparison ends in many ways, but still, so that's the magnitude of it. Then we have the Trump presidency, and the narrative of breaking up this globalization wave only gets stronger. So suddenly we're talking about my country first. We're pointing fingers, and as much as some rebalancing has to happen, I think very few would argue against it, but the way it's happening is actually, it's messing with the globalization sentiment. And then we have the US walk away from the Paris Agreement, the nuclear deal with Iran, the TPP, which is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, so a trade deal that has been forged over years, one that actually exempted China, but gave the other Asian countries an opportunity to trade much more. And the same with TTIP. So this was it. So the Transatlantic Trade and Partnership and Investment Agreement, which was worked on for 7 years, millions of billed hours by lawyers across the Atlantic. And unfortunately, the US decides to walk away. So again, just to give you a sense of this tsunami of everybody closer together is beginning to show some cracks. And then in the end, we simply have a weakening of the Western-led international institutions. So they're less and less impactful. The multilateralism is giving way to bilateral agreements because they're simply moving too slow. So what would happen if we were at the end of the Western-led globalization? Well, it's not necessarily a bad thing, because perhaps it's someone else's turn. And mind you, before the Industrial Revolution, it came down to how many people did you have to do the work? So it came down to labor and land. And back then, India and China were the ruling economies because they had the labor and the land. So the world that we are used to living in, the Coca-Cola at the end of the Amazon experience, is something relatively new. But of course, it would take a lot of rebalancing, and all rebalancing usually hurts, and takes some getting used to, and it's not friction-free. But problem is also that polarization has been increasing. So this is not only internationally. So not only are we seeing this twist of power, of the power axes and the gravity moving towards the east, we're also seeing it internally in the countries. So as much as people have been getting richer across, the internal polarization and inequality has also been on the rise. I don't know if you're familiar with the Gini coefficient, but it's an economic coefficient used to express inequality in society. It ranks between 0 and 1. So if you're at 1, it means that one person has everything, and if you're at 0, that means everybody has the same. So most countries would be somewhere in between, but an arrow upwards means an increase in inequality. So you're concentrating wealth. And the takeaway from this chart for me is that most countries, that the OECD countries, etc., so that would look to for comparison, are actually getting more unequal. So the only country we've seen a decrease has been in Turkey and a little bit in Greece, but there you can talk about other structural issues. But over the last 30 years, the inequality within the countries has actually been increasing, which means you create tension. You create the Brexit movements, you create the closing of borders and put my country first again, because we're trying to fix structural problems with short-term solution and empty promises. But while all of this is happening, we're having a rebalancing globally. So the G7, which in all fairness, you can argue it's also a little bit a thing of the past, because the G7 includes countries like Italy. And I love Italy, but they're hardly one of the biggest and most impactful countries in the world today. And yet we refer to the G7 as something, as a union of countries that have impact. And the E7 are the biggest emerging economies. And as you can obviously see on the first chart on the left, that as we reach the middle of the century, they're going to surpass us twice. And since if we're talking about a pie chart, it is a zero-sum game. Wealth is not, but if in terms of influence, something's got to give, and that means the US and the European Union are going to give away some of their influence globally, and China and India are going to step up and take a bigger share. It's not necessarily a bad thing, because again, trade, wealth, economic activity, employment, etc., all of that feeds off each other and could very well have positive feedback loops into every region. But if we're talking about who influences the standards and what are the brands, etc., well, then there may be a shift coming, because suddenly the things that drove us to the dominance that we had are now shifting into the hands of others. The positive news is that all of this is not coming out of nothing, and more than 85% of the next billion people in the middle class are actually going to be in Asia, which means there's an enormous potential, an enormous market. And as much as we trade together these days, that's a great market for most. Right. But if we look at this, the balance shifts, unfortunately, there's a framework around it, and we talked about these institutions around them. So the Bretton Woods institutions, the WTO, IMF, World Bank, etc. Well, right now, the power balance doesn't really reflect reality, so something's going to have to give. So if we look at the population size, BRICS, and here S is South Africa, are 40% of the global population, 41, while G7 is only 10. Now, if we look at the share world GDP, and this was a number from a couple of years ago, so I've shown you the expected projection, so you can imagine how this number is actually going to increase in the upper side. And they're almost a quarter of the GDP, while G7 is still bigger. Now, this is where it gets interesting. These are the voting powers in the World Bank. Now you can argue, yes, the G7 have, oops, I'm not sure what happened. You can argue the G7 have bigger GDPs and have a bigger influence. But at some point, if you are home to 40% of the world population, and if you are increasing your share of GDP, you're going to want more than 18% of the votes. And the World Bank is one of the institutions we put in place to keep all of this in balance. So eventually something's going to have to give, and the sooner the better, in the sense that if you're not being included in club, eventually you're gonna start your own, and then we may see a bigger fragmentation that we've seen already. In interest of time, I'll skip a few things. So just to summarize on the geopolitics and the globalization bit, there is a power shift going on, and it's across two particular axes. So we're going from west to east. So we're seeing the rise of externalization. That's hardly news to anyone, but it's just, I hope I'm giving you a flavor also of what it means underneath. So it means the setting of standards. It means the names of the next institutions. It means the next brand you're going to find when you're a remote location, the languages, et cetera, et cetera. And at the same time, we're seeing, again, I'm only happy to see, not happy to see, that's probably an I told you so moment, but COVID has only increased the sentiment of regionalization, fragmentation. I will never argue that it's a good thing, but at least we called the right drivers a couple of years ago. We said there is an increasing fragmentation building underneath this shift, because no ruling power is going to give it away peacefully, and the rise of someone new is always going to give you frictions. So we're looking at an increasing fragmentation, regionalization. Very quickly, I'll just give you a quick rundown what I meant when I said technological development. Again, now we go back more than 100 years. So we had the industrial revolutions, right? The Industrial Revolution 1 and then 2. The first model Ford is the first of world affordable car, and it's built in the West in 1910 to 30. Then we have the radio broadcast, the refrigerator, which completely revolutionized the way we structure our homes, our families, etc., because you could preserve food, which meant the role of women at home changed, etc. The color TV, again, all of these things are coming from the Northern Hemisphere, right? So the atomic bomb, the first jet engine, Sputnik by the Soviet Union, we suddenly take up space, Gagarin, Apollo lands on the moon. Then we have Apple, which of course makes its mark on the world. We have the space station, the World Wide Web. All of this is still a very one-sided thing. So we're to the left. We're to the left of the Ural Mountains, and then you have the iPhone, the touchscreen, the Hyperloop, etc. And we're testing SpaceX flights. Again, entering the next century with great optimism, feeling strong, standing on our pillars, saying, "Technology is ours. It's great. We want to share. We want to learn." Now we've seen a lot of technological progress coming out of Asia in particular, but we still felt like this is our thing. And then you know what's going to happen here. Suddenly we have 5G networks. So the next generation of connectivity is actually not dominated by us. We've seen the headlines and the Huawei disputes, etc. But suddenly a whole new breakthrough in technology is not something that we're pioneering. Supercomputer-wise, China is home to almost half of the world's supercomputers. 5 out of 10 global producers of electric vehicles are Chinese. And that's often, when I show this in Scandinavia, we're a little bit shocked because we feel we own the green agenda. You know, we have hydropower, we've got wind, a lot of electric vehicles, we have these high bars for our climate ambitions, etc. But half of the electric vehicle producers are actually in China. China's space program lands on the dark side of the moon. Now imagine what that would do to the album cover of Pink Floyd. But jokes aside, that's quite an achievement. And again, it's suddenly we're to the right of the Ural Mountains on the world map. China is rapidly overtaking the US and Europe in spending on R&D. And I don't mean to be so China focused, but these are just really interesting examples. And of course, China has been quite in the forefront of these things over the last couple of years. Then we talk about our own development, and 43% of all FDI, so foreign direct investments in biotech in the US, is actually from Asian nations. And there's a very ambitious plan in China of Made in China 2025, where the leadership has zoomed in on 10 particular sectors, which are very high-tech sectors, to grow and increase their capabilities and potentially dominance. and these are aerospace, nanotechnologies, etc. So this is no longer just a sweatshop of the world where they produce McDonald's Happy Meals figurines. These are ambitious plans of actually taking turf. And then last but not least, we have the CRISPR twins. I don't know how many are familiar with CRISPR technology, but this is one of the latest things in biotech, at least. I mean, the technology itself is not new, but the way it's been in the headlines and the way it's been applied over the last couple of years is revolutionizing the way we look at health going forward. So this is, in rough terms, I'm not a biologist, but as far as I know, it allows you for copy-paste in your genetic code. So that means that if I had a genetic disease, you could actually go in and edit my genetic code as an adult and remove that. Now, what was starting about this particular experiment is that there's still a lot of ethical debate on whether or not you can edit germline. So being embryos in a stage where they would actually pass things on. So if I was subject to CRISPR technology today, it would only edit my DNA. So it would edit some cells and it would edit them only in me. Even if I had children later, it would not be passed on. So it would stop with me. What was done in China, and I believe the professor has been dismissed since, in a public ethic outcry against this, is because when you start editing germline, you're editing embryos, which means whatever changes you make, things we can't yet control, know the full effect of, etc., is actually going to be passed on when they have children. So suddenly it's an exponential effect where we lose control. So quite a milestone there. And again, the cracks are put together. These are great technological progresses. So now we can see there was a Turkish couple in Germany who came up with the vaccine that we're all putting our bets on now. So in the end, it doesn't matter who came up with something, but it's just to say, if you're betting your global identity on technological leadership, then it's probably a good time to look yourself in the mirror and see the cracks and say, we're not in the driver's seat anymore in many ways. So potentially partnerships, collaboration, synergies are the way to go, and not necessarily go for dominating leadership. And this is just some of the GDP and R&D spending, just as an example. Actually, with only 5 minutes left, I think I will leave it here. And I know I didn't touch climate, but honestly, I think it doesn't deserve much else narrative than to say we've been taking it for granted. We're seeing, some people would argue that we're seeing the ecological and the weather-like effects. Others would argue that, there's always fluctuations. But if anything, I think it's fair to say the 97% of the scientists who agree that we have an issue and it's likely anthropogenic, the climate is a pillar we've been taking for granted for way too long, and it's also giving way to cracks. So I think I will leave it there. 4 pillars. All of them are something we took for granted at the turn of the century. They're all changing for better or worse, but it's something we absolutely have to be aware of when we look 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years ahead. And I'll leave a little bit of room for questions.
So, Daria, everyone is just saying that it's fascinating. We needed more time. Very insightful review of the state of the world. That we should have add more time to this presentation, so you can continue going on and on the pillars and how they are crumbling. And it's been indeed very insightful and fascinating to see the overall analysis on how the dominance is taking the power out of the Western society, which probably it was there somehow stealed from the rest of the world, given the First Nations and other things in other presentations that were talking why we were dominating things as Western societies and how that is going back, not only in Asia, but also in places like Canada or the US, going back to the First Nations. And it's absolutely fascinating. And I wonder, one of the questions I have is, we did this cultural globalization with the super nice picture of the Coca-Cola in the Antarctica. And it's like, how are you going to how do you envision that is going to roll back and stop removing that concept? Even though the economies and the power shift, how do you remove the cultural impact of the Western society into the global culture?
Well, we don't necessarily have to eliminate them, right? So I think it's, first of all, they're here to stay. They're sticky. There's still many places in the world where Coca-Cola or the rest of them are some sort of, it's a symbol of luxury. So say in development economics, we often looked at, if you have a certain amount of nutrition in a country and you have a certain income, we're talking about very poor countries. We said, okay, if we double their income, we would double their nutrition. They would go and they would buy more grains or rice or whatever, and calorie intake would increase. Turned out to be wrong. For the extra $1, someone would go out and buy a can of Coca-Cola, which means they're still starving, but they had the symbol. So I think symbols are sticky and they will stay, but I do think we will have competing, suddenly we'll have competing globalizing, be it brands, be it standards, being ways of doing things, or complete. I mean, now you're seeing young people are more into sharing, caring, all the rest of it, and it may very well be a regional trend, but I don't think so. So I think perhaps these brands are just going to be watered out in terms of some of the new consumer logic. So I don't think they're going to be entirely removed, but I hope it's going to be a peaceful coexistence with other things on the offer.
We have one question here from Darwin Antipolo. I put it on screen because it's interestingly talking about patching or building new ones on the cracking pillars.
Well, of course, first of all, I picked pillars I could crack, right? So there's a little bit of a selection. There was a selection bias in the analysis, no doubt. But the metaphor was so strong that we were building something. So I absolutely agree that I think we should build new ones. And sometimes if you look at the old cathedrals, now I know in Denmark, if you look at some of the old churches, I mean, they're found runes, so like the Viking writing and some of the rocks that were used later for cathedrals in the Christian metaphors. So I think in many ways we could use the same thinking. So we can break things up, take what we can use, and build something new. I think that's the art of circularity, that we have to reuse things. And there are many concepts that are useful from the last century, but I think they need an update, and we need to build new structures with old building blocks also.
And the cathedral metaphor is really interesting, because you remember what happened with the Notre Dame Cathedral? When it burned out, everyone around the world was donating money to have it as it was, as a symbol. It was a symbol of something that everyone visited somehow, and you connect to it. But at the same time, we weren't able to collect the same amount of money for other countries or other issues like the California fires, the Australian bushfires, things in Africa. And suddenly we were loving the symbol of the Notre Dame Cathedral, Paris, and how we connected to that. So probably it relates to the thing you said about the Coca-Cola, how we love the symbols, and we want to preserve that.
People are not rational. Let's just state that. We're not rational. We're emotional and not rational.
Okay, so we need to close the presentation here. So Daria, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for engaging with us, and thank you to the Copenhagen Institute for Future Studies to approach us, to approach and engage in this here in this Foresight Summit. We know that this is not the usual thing that you do, so we want to thank you very, very high, and encourage everyone to go and learn what they are doing, because they have very good programs that you can engage with and be part of the institute, and you can see all the work that they do that is pretty amazing, and is even beyond in terms of quality of the presentation that you just have seen. So thank you so much, and everyone else, just stay on the same page. We are going to talk with Pratishka Singh on India, and how what is going on in India right now with the pandemic changed her view on what the future is and foresight, and why we should be changing things. So it's going to be a very personal experience on how it shifts the mindset towards something that is happening today. Thanks again, Daria, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you.